for joining us. We've got a wonderful session for you today on pollinators and their associated plants. So we're going to go ahead and get started with introductions from our panelists today. We've got a really good group. Let's go ahead and get started. Beth, Bolles, y'all just give us a quick introduction and say hello.
Glad to be with you talking about pollinators, native ones, native plants. I'm Beth with Escambia County, all the way over here close to Alabama.
All right. And next we got Julie McConnell.
Hey, how's everyone doing? I am in Panama City. I'm a horticulture agent in Bay County.
Glad to see you, Julie. We've got a new face with us today. I think Ashley Stonecipher. What's up, Ashley?
Hi, yes, I'm here in Mariana, and I'm a horticulture agent for Jackson County.
Yes, the center of the universe. Stephen Greer.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm Stephen Greer. I'm the CD and a little slant in horticulture for a lot of years of playing in it. I'm in Santa Rosa County and in Milton, right next to Escambia.
Yeah, so we got a good representation from all across the Panhandle. Hopefully we can answer the questions that y'all have for us today. We're going to go ahead and get started with a quick question. Just a general question that'll really get us kicked off here. What is pollination? And I'm going to let Julie answer that.
Well, just really, I'm not going to get into all the technical terms, but pollination is really important for, it's basically sexual reproduction for plants. So that's where we have our genetic material mixes together and you have your fruit or your seed that forms that's going to start a new plant that's got some diversity in it that hopefully would make it better able to survive in the environment.
Beautiful definition. Let's go ahead and move to Beth, going all the way, as she said, almost to Alabama. So we're moving all the way across the Panhandle. Beth, are native plants preferable to non-natives as food sources for native pollinators, or does it not matter? You hear a lot of native plants are better. Shed some light on this for us.
So remember, today we're talking about native pollinators. So in general, when we kind of look at that topic, it would be suitable to have native plants because they have really co-evolved together. However, if all you have is native plants, you are going to miss out on a little bit, maybe seasonally or through different months, because those non-native plants, pollinators still are going to go to many of those that we often grow in the ornamental landscape and use those as a food source. So they really offer a lot for us as well, especially in our landscapes where we may not have the suitable landscape for native plants. So we really want a mix of both.
Awesome. A little bit of both. That's the way to go. Beth, if you will, stay with us for a second. And so we've got a really interesting question here. Lots of folks wonder this one. So can cross-pollination occur across species barriers and genus barriers, or does it have to stay specific insect, specific species, that sort of thing? How does this work?
All right. So I was kind of looking at this in the matter of plants. So when we look at plant species, think of hollies. You know, we have a lot of different hollies in the Ilex genus, and a lot of times we can have pollen that moves from one holly to a different holly, but that doesn't always hold true for every single plant. So when you're looking at very closely related plants in that group within that genus, you can have pollen that moves back and forth from time to time. When we get more in different genera, that's when it gets a little more complicated. It does happen, but it's not going to happen that often. Many of you may know Leland cypress, and that is actually a cross of two different genera that are closely related within the same family. They have similar characteristics, but those two came together to make our, whether you like it or not, the Leland cypress. And so a lot of times in the plant world with that pollination, you will see an X in front of that name that means two different genus or genera. If you have an X in the middle, like Abelia X grandiflora, that means two abelias came together. And sometimes people are involved in this and a lot of manipulation happens. But you're really going to see closely related species that are going to be more where pollen moves between those.
So my hopes for a knockout rose and oak tree hybrid are not probably going to happen.
Unless we have some kind of crazy radioactive wave that falls upon us, probably not, Daniel.
Well, darn, that's too bad. Let's move on to Ashley. Ashley, this is a really good question. This Zoom listener believes they have a lack of pollinators for their fruit orchard. So what can they do to bring pollinators in, make pollinators available for these early blossoming fruits? I assume they're probably talking about, things like peaches, pears, blueberries, things like that bloom early in the season.
Yes, there's a few things they could do. One is to plant some of, those pollinator plants that you are blooming that time of year. Another really good option is to get a hold of a bee farmer, and you can actually bring beehives into your grove and use that as a pollinating thing during those seasons when you need it. And a third option is to plant cover crops. So there's certain cover crops that do well in the cool season that would be in full bloom at that time that would also attract those pollinators to the area.
Very good. Yeah. Those are three really good methods. If that doesn't do it for you, you're just not going to get pollinators. That you should have success with at least one of those three right there. Julie, this is an interesting question I wanted to ask. So we like to attract pollinators, but is it possible to have too many options in pollinator attracting? So do pollinators plants compete with each other? Is it possible to have too many types of pollinator plants?
I don't really think that it is, because really there's usually going to be more available than the insects that are going to show up. It's not like you're going to have a swarm of locusts show up and that you're not going to be able to leave your house. Having that diversity and that staggered bloom time is really going to help, especially the way that our seasons just kind of fluctuate in temperature, where one day it's 40 degrees and you're not going to see any insect activity, and then you've got the 70s for a week. You have all this going on. And if you don't have staggered bloom times and different types of flowers, then there could be some insects that aren't going to be able to get the nectar and pollen that they need. So I don't think you can have too many. I think that diversity is always a great thing.
Well, that's good news for those of us that like to spend our money at Lowe's and garden centers. There is no cap on the amount of plants that you're allowed to have for pollinators. That's good. Beth, we have lots of people asking this question, and just give us an overview here. What are just kind of our broad categories of native pollinators, and then just in general, kind of some of their favorite flowers.
All right, so we're going to cover a lot of flowers today that as we go through, so I won't hit too many here. But when we think about pollinators, we always think about the honeybee, and we know honeybee is not a native pollinator, even though it provides wonderful services. But people don't realize that native bees, and many of these are more solitary than we think of a honeybee being, they are really prevalent in the garden. So when you go out and look at a flower, you're often going to see a native bee like a sweat bee that's very metallic. You may see a big leaf cutter bee chewing the edge out of your redbud tree. You may see a plaster bee or a longhorn bee. There's so many different that are out there in the bee world. Bumblebees and carpenter bees for sure. Those are great native bee pollinators. Now, from that, we do have some beetles that do pollination. That's a little different flower that they get on, more open flower, very fragrant. And then we also have our butterflies that we're going to cover today. We've got some questions on different butterflies. They will visit a different type of flower because their mouth part is very long. They can get in a long tubular type flower, whereas a lot of our native bees have very short tongues and they require different types of flowers. And then finally, a lot of people don't realize that flies are important pollinators. In addition to that, they provide a great service, many of them as actually parasitizing other insects or being a predator of other insects like our syrphid fly. So lots of things in the garden we see every day. We just don't realize the benefits that they're providing in that garden in pollination services.
So it's not just bees and butterflies.
Not at all.
All right. Making it more complicated. And we just had a question come in the chat, and y'all feel free, our attendees, to type in questions down in that Q&A or in the chat, and we'll try to get to those if we can. So we'll get to that in just a minute. All right, Julie, Beth mentioned these a second ago, I think. The question is from Zoom, are wasps pollinators?
They are. They actually are. And you know, a lot of your wasps are predators, which is really helpful for managing some of our you know, our plant eating insects, but they have to fuel flight. So they visit and they obtain nectar. Some of them also eat pollen or collect pollen for their young. They don't all get, you know, live insects, but some of them do that or do a combination of both. So they definitely are capable of providing pollination services. And they're really kind of get a bad rap because you have a couple that can be a little bit aggressive, but there are tons that are not aggressive and definitely have a place in the garden. And I've got an article that I think our moderator is going to put in the chat on that.
Awesome. Yeah, I know everybody likes to kill wasps, but I guess they do offer some good landscape services. So maybe put the wasp spray up if you can. Okay. Too bad. Beth, we'll go back to you. I promise, Stephen, we're going to get to you here in a second. Don't over there in Santa Rosa County. We're coming to you shortly. Beth, this is an interesting question. This kind of goes back to the diversity question that Julie was talking about, having a diversity of plants. Is a diversity of a few types of flowers or clusters of a few types of flowers better than many different kinds? So should you group your pollinator flowers together or just kind of mix them all in?
Well, as we know, as gardeners, we have probably hundreds of different plants in our landscapes. But if you really want to attract pollinators, you do need a variety of different plants. You need different sizes, different flower shapes. That's very important. But you want to cluster some of these together. Think about when you go out and you look at your Stokes aster. If you just have one and it has 3 or 4 flowers on it, those pollinators are active all over, but they move quickly. So if you have a grouping of 4, 5, 6 of those, of whatever same plant it is, that's going to really benefit them in finding that food and nectar. So have a variety. I think the information in a document we posted said at least 10 different plants, and you want those spaced throughout the season as well. So you have pollinators visiting at different times of the year, but you want to cluster some of these together to get real benefit from those pollinators visiting that one group.
Makes perfect sense to me. Thanks for shedding a little bit of light on that. Stephen, your long-awaited time has come. We got a bunch of different questions on this. Everybody always wants to know the one plant that is the best pollinator plant. And so I'm going to put you on the spot here and just, you know, it doesn't have to be necessarily the best. I'm not sure there even is a best, but just, you know, a couple of really good annual and perennial plants for drawing pollinators to the garden that, you know, you could go to your local garden center today and find that are fairly common.
Okay. I think you answered it all, so we can move to the next, right?
All right.
But it is true. There's, you know, when you start talking about the best, it's a personal choice. What you're looking for, what it goes into the garden. I tend to lean more toward what is your garden like? Is it full sun? Is it partial shade, afternoon shade versus morning shade, drainage, soil pH, is all those things are organics. I first like to look at all those things before I really start thinking about what I'm going to have for show out there. You know, best perennials, some good old solid performers like the old black-eyed Susan and some of the blanket flowers and some of those unique things that go on. You know, you can even get into the cardinal flower if you really like to pull some red in some wetland areas. In terms of annuals, that's a little harder if you're looking at just native. You know, you like you said, you may want to go to the garden centers or box stores and really see the things, look at the colors and the depthness of the throat. Think about the bumblebees and things. They have to, you know, if it's a deep throat, they have to carve in from the edge to get to it. So it's, you know, there's a lot of things to think about when you're doing this.
Man, I knew you were going to give that "it depends" answer, and you did it. So
okay,
that's good though. Yeah, I mean, that just goes to show that there's not a silver bullet, you know, one plant that everybody can plant for pollinators. You know, milkweed's a super, you know, popular plant, but like Stephen mentioned, if you have that heavy shade yard with a bunch of big live oaks, milkweed's probably not going to be for you, you know, and so you'll have to adapt to that. So
I like mixes.
Thanks, Stephen. Very good. Julie, this is a great question. So like the questions that we had for Stephen, with annual and perennial plants, that's primarily what we think of when we think of pollinating, attracting plants. But your question is a little bit different. So what are some shrubs that benefit pollinators? And the question said and birds, but we'll focus specifically on pollinators here.
Yeah, well, and a lot of times, really, you can kind of generalize it. So if you think about if the plant flowers, then it's most likely going to benefit some type of pollinator. If it's an ornamental grass that's wind pollinated, then maybe, maybe not. But we're also actually finding that some insects are foraging pollen off of different types of grasses, even turf grasses. So, that doesn't even rule them out. But as far as some good shrubs that perform well in Northwest Florida, beautyberry, blueberries, wax myrtle, which could be kind of a small tree.
We'll allow it.
Your palmetto, your saw palmetto, if you have that growing somewhere, instead of fighting it, you might just let it go because it's going to benefit both birds and insects. A lot of viburnums and hollies are really good too, because you'll have, of course, your flowers and your flower clusters, and then you have the possibility of some fruit. So.
Nice. You got some pretty good low maintenance options there too. I like that.
Definitely.
Yeah, got to have the low maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
Beth, so this is a question just for you, since you have a beach in your county. So what are some of the best drought tolerant, full sun pollinator plants for very sandy soils? So, we've got that site that it's kind of tough. It gets really hot and dry and our soil's sandy to start with. What can we do there for pollinating, attracting plants?
Yeah, and even though I live north in Santa Rosa County, I do have a beach property because it is super sandy soil. So I grow Conradina. I love false rosemary. I love Georgia savory, the Clinopodium, saw palmetto, like Julie mentioned, beautyberry, silkgrass, firebush, Hamelia patens. These are good pollinator plants, and they do well once they're established without a lot of supplemental water, unless we go through a 2-month drought, like it seems like we're in right now. Hollies do great too. People kind of forget about hollies and this wonderful plant as a screen or an accent, but when that is in flower, it is alive with different pollinators. So think of those for very drought tolerant plants.
Very good. I know that's a tough spot. You gave us some great options for there. So we're going to move to kind of different times of the year and what we can do as far as specific or targeting plants that are blooming at specific times of the year. And Julie, you're going to hit both of these actually. So we're going to start in the fall and then move to the winter. So Julie, what fall perennial pollinator plants are recommended, for zone 8B? This listener was in Tallahassee, Monticello area, but just for the Panhandle at large, what can we do for the fall?
Well, one of my favorites is swamp sunflower, the Helianthus angustifolia.
Beautiful.
Because it blooms so late, it really gets a lot of height in the garden, and it'll take areas that flood or get kind of swampy. So it's kind of a neat plant. Although I've seen it in dry areas too. It's really, really resilient. That's probably one of my favorites. Also the fire spike, and oh geez, I just had it. Goldenrod, the cardinal flower that Stephen mentioned, that's a good one too. Saltbush. So if you have an area that's kind of, you may have salt spray or that's an issue, that's one to think of. And I always, whenever I see those blooming, a lot of the monarchs as they're traveling through really flock to that particular shrub. As far as in the I'm going to go ahead and go to the winter because that's kind of next. And keep in mind,
let's move into the cold weather. Go for it.
Yeah, you get into cold weather, and some of these things, maybe they bloom when it is really definitely winter, and then some of them it's just really, really early spring where things are still kind of marginal. But Mahonia and Fatsia are great for shady areas. I think a lot of people don't realize that Mahonia gets a lot of blooms on it.
Love that Mahonia.
Yeah, the soft caress is really nice. It's not spiky. It doesn't hurt you like some of the old fashioned ones do. Camellias are great. So we have fall blooming and winter blooming camellias.
All right, the person who posted the camellia question in the chat, listen up. Now is your time.
Yes. So your Camellia sasanquas tend to be fall bloomers. Your Camellia japonicas maybe fall all the way through early spring. So that gives you a lot, and they're evergreen. So, it's really offers a lot of interest in the garden, but also some of your cool season vegetables like carrots or parsley or things in that family. They're going to be blooming when it's cool out still. And then some of them also serve as larval host plants for some of your butterflies. So those are some options for that fall winter transition.
Yeah, great list. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Beth, this is I say this, they're all interesting questions, but this one is kind of particularly interesting to me. I've not really thought about this. So this listener says wild radish was blooming profusely up to just a couple weeks ago. I consider that a field weed, but is it considered a pollen source? This person didn't see many insects on it this year. So what say you about the wild radish?
Yeah, so if you look up about wild radish, you will come across a lot of articles that probably Daniel has written about how to manage this in pasture lands and fields. But on the roadsides in a natural area, wild radish is going to serve a lot of our native bees. We have a lot of sweat bees, which is in the halictid family on that. And that's the very metallic bee that is a beautiful smaller bee. We have even bumblebees and carpenter bees on that, and then even plasterer bees. So this is host to a lot of native bees. So you may not always see them in activity. Maybe the flowers weren't fully opened at that time, or they were kind of past due and you just didn't see the pollinators. But yeah, if you can let wild radish go and have a spot for that, you will be serving in that kind of winter, springtime, a lot of these native bees.
Okay, very good. So even the weeds attract the bees and the pollinators. So sometimes they do a great job of it too, it sounds like. All right, Ashley, we're coming back to you there in Mariana. Zoom listener says, are spice bushes, a plant that is somewhat obscure, not super available, are spice bushes good pollinator plants for the Panhandle?
Spice bush is good. It is a good host for the swallowtail. So it has the Pollinators swallowtail and then the spice bush swallowtail butterfly. Both are host, both require or need that plant. It is very good. It attracts pollinators. It has an edible fruit and a fragrance. So it is a good wildlife food source as well.
Interesting. I don't know that I've ever actually seen a spice bush in person. If I did, I didn't know what it was. So I just learned something. So thanks, Ashley. We're coming right back to you. Stay with you for a second. Is cilantro, the little herb, we know cilantro is good to eat, but is it a good plant for pollinators?
Cilantro is another one that's good, especially so in Florida. It bolts readily here in Florida in the heat. So those beautiful flowers is what's going to attract the bees and other insects. And then just to add to that, there are some other herbs that are really good for pollinators. Basil, your mints, oregano, and rosemary are some good herbs as well.
All right. So herbs can also be learning all kinds of stuff here. It's very good. Stephen, we hinted at we had butterfly questions. And so the butterfly questions have arrived. We had many people ask about how to attract the eastern black swallowtail and the tiger swallowtail butterflies. Here in Florida, we love our swallowtails.
Mm-hmm.
So in your opinion, what are some good plants that we can include in the landscape to specifically target these two butterfly species?
Well, there are some good natives out there that we can really take advantage of. And then a few things that aren't native, like my lemon tree in the container, they loved it last year. I wound up having about 45 caterpillars or feeding on it heavily. Oh, by the way, when it's a young larva stage, it looks a lot like a bird dropping. So don't squish it off and squish it on the ground or wash it off. Be careful, check it first before you do that.
Okay.
Sometimes you can lightly squeeze it and looks like little orange horns pop up. And that's when you know.
Honestly, pretty gross, but I now know what to look for.
No, that's why I asked my wife to do it first. She didn't appreciate that, by the way. But, there's some other things before I touch on that completely. Think about some other things that are in the garden that aren't native. When you're growing your herbs, your dills, your parsley, and those things, they really, really love to lay and feed on that and lay the eggs and things. So it's don't forget fennel. It loves fennel.
Okay.
But when I'm really looking at the swallowtail, I start thinking about milkweed and some of the ironweed. It's a nice purple flower that's edge of gardens. It really is a nice fall bloomer. Then you get into the bishopweed, the mock bishopweed, which is in the carrot family, and start moving through some of those. And so these plants, sometimes you really have to hunt for in the nursery industry to find them. So call Daniel, in Calhoun County, and he'll direct her right where to go for her.
Yeah, the nursery industry capital of the world for sure here in Calhoun. All right, thanks, Stephen. That's a good answer. So if you do those things, you're gonna have swallowtails in your yard. Stephen guarantees it. So that's awesome. All right, so we got a really fun question here. I always like these ones. I'm not sure if that was proper English, these ones, but the question is, I want everybody on our panel to give me their favorite pollinator plant. And those of you that are behind the scenes, you can type one in the chat if you want to, but I'm just going to go kind of round table here, and we'll start with Beth Bolles. Beth, give me favorite pollinator plant if you had to pick one.
I love African blue basil. It is not native, but if you want to attract bees and all sorts of bees, both native and non-native bees, and various ones at different times of the year, you can grow the annual African blue basil, maybe perennial for a few of you along the coast, but usually we have to replant this one, and it is sterile, so we grow this from cuttings.
Yeah, Lisa Fulton's excited to see that from your plant sale, so that's awesome. Yeah, that's such a pretty plant too in the landscape. All right, Ashley, your favorite pollinator plant if you had to pick one.
I really like Coreopsis, and Coreopsis is our Florida state wildflower.
That it is. Good choice. Coreopsis is really pretty in the spring. Julie, throwing it down to you in Panama City.
Dotted horseman is my favorite because it's got a really strange flower, and anytime I need bug pictures, I can go out and find so many different ones. It's really great if you like to look at bugs. It's a good one.
Everybody is so on brand so far. Beth picks a really nice ornamental. Ashley does the native plant, weird that nobody has really seen very much of. So that's great. On brand. Stephen, what you got?
Well, I'm kind of just the old school that you see in so many gardens where you can pick up in a lot of the garden centers is in the salvia family, the blue purple, because I like to see the hummingbirds work, when you're sitting at the window and watching them really moving around out there.
Nice. Stephen's old school. All right. So we're going, my favorite thing to do outside is to vegetable garden. So what I'm probably going to say is buckwheat is my favorite pollinator plant. You find all kinds of stuff. So this goes back to what Beth and some of these folks were talking about a little while ago. You look at buckwheat and they're just bugs of all kinds. It's not necessarily the big pretty butterflies. It's a lot of flies. It's a lot of just weird stuff shows up that you don't necessarily think about, but the garden is alive when you have buckwheat in it. So I do like the buckwheat there. So we're going to move on a little bit. Thank you for that little interlude. Get everybody's favorite pollinator plants. Julie, this is a really interesting question. And we do have a problem with this, particularly in the Panhandle. I feel like there's some more solutions as you move down the state, but in the Panhandle, we do need better access to native plants. So in your opinion, how can we go about making better access to natives possible?
Well, I actually, before I came into Extension, I was in the nursery business for 10 years. And we really struggled with finding a lot of native plants. And part of the problem was that as a grower, as an ornamental grower, the nursery folks, they need a plant that a garden center is going to want to put on the shelf and that people are going to buy, and what we consider retail ready. That's what we would call it. So the plant needs to look good. You're selling things when they're blooming. You're selling things when they're at their peak of whatever their ornamental value is. And some of our native plants, one, don't transplant well. And so you don't have a good survivability trying to grow it from a container. And the other one is that sometimes they just don't like to be in a container, even if they will transplant, and they don't look very good. And so that is a real struggle for your production nurseries of, they don't want to grow something that's going to get rejected when they send it to the garden center. So what kind of will help overcome that, and where we saw more native plants become available, is when the demand was so great and that the consumers understood that maybe it's not going to look like one of those showy azaleas. It may look like a bundle of sticks. And so really you have to just ask for them. Another thing is to check with the Florida Native Plant Society. They do have some resources. Unfortunately, we as extension agents are not allowed to recommend particular nurseries or recommend vendors, but some of your organizations can. And so the Florida Wildflower Association, the Florida Native Plant Society, sometimes it's good just to connect with those people, because sometimes you can swap plants or share seeds, or they can lead you to a resource that has good native plants that are really from this region. Because sometimes we have plants that are technically they're native, but if it's really from a region across the country, they may not perform well in Florida, and we have pretty tough climate conditions. So connect with those groups, and then also just continue with the demand and lower your expectations on how showy it's going to look if you get some.
Yeah, it's definitely, like you mentioned, it's definitely tough, because I mean, with the nursery industry the way it is now, if you go to a nursery garden center, you're going to see all these pretty branded pots, and the plants have to look good in those pretty branded pots. And if they don't, they're probably not going to get grown. So those are some challenges, and you did a good job of answering that, Julie.
Well, I want to kind of sneak in something. I tend to visit the markdown section at garden centers, because once plants don't look retail ready anymore, basically they stop blooming, they'll discount them. And I benefit from that because I know that they're going to bloom again eventually.
Julie shops the plant rehab clinic, so it can be done, that's for sure. Stephen, coming back to you. Yeah, in case y'all didn't know, Stephen has done a ton of work before his extension career started with HOAs and developments and things like that in our area in the Panhandle. So this is a great question for you, Stephen. What methods have been successful to approach HOAs to approve native plants in homeowners' properties? And maybe share some of your previous work experiences in this one.
Yeah, this could be a long article and not necessarily exciting, to be quite honest.
Right.
But there's some real key parts you go through. And the first thing is do your homework before you approach anybody. Have conversations with your neighbors if you're out, strolling through the neighborhood. Kind of get a feel where people are on this. What you don't want to do is charge in there with all this excitement, enthusiasm, and bang the desk and tell them this is what I want to do. That will turn the group the other way. HOAs are different. There's some that have very few components in it about how the HOA runs, besides maybe making sure the front entryways are well maintained and things are mulched. Others are very, very detailed. And I did work with an organization through St. Joe Company and some of their South Walton developments in there with Watercolor, Water Sound, and several others. Get to know your neighborhood. Go see your local soil and water office and take a look at the soil types that are there before you start talking plant materials and natives and how you're going to use them and those things. Get to know your homeowner board. Talk to them individually. Get a feel for what they're doing. If you get a lot of negativity, there's going to be some serious education that needs to occur before you approach from that side of it. You're basically building consensus before you go into a formal situation and make that presentation and have this big list of plants you want included on the, whether it's, and that's the other part. Do you have covenants or do you have bylaws?
Is there a difference?
Yes. Covenants are largely guidelines. There's no enforcement tool behind it. They are basically, when people move in the neighborhood, they might be there 20 years. You're making a long-term promise to make some efforts that direction type thing. Bylaws, that's exactly what they're telling you they are. There's normally some level of enforcement behind it. Say you have bylaws and somebody's not mowing their yard for the last year, and they hire somebody to come in and mow, and they send you the bill. Guess what? You're obligated because you signed that contract. You've got to pay that bill, or they're going to lock it in on a mechanical lien at the tail end if you ever sell, and they're going to get it one way or the other. So, this is what you've got to know, is understand what your HOA is. Is it still controlled by an association or a developer? Then it's a design review board, not necessarily an HOA if they still have controlling interest. So those are the things you have to look at.
Fascinating. I didn't know all those things, but you're such great advice. Don't blow up the bridge right at the beginning. Build. Don't let people. It's a lot easier to get that done when people don't have negative feelings towards you at the beginning. So
yeah, you never know when you got to come back and ask for something else. So
that's right. Just be a nice person, right? There you go.
Yes.
So Beth, a little bit different. I love Stephen's discussion there on HOA law. That was pretty interesting. So do pollinators need supplemental things like bee water dishes if there aren't really a lot of flowers available? So do you need to supplement nutrition for your pollinators?
So this is an animal, so they do need water, and it's really important. A lot of times they can get moisture from food that they eat, and they'll find it in the landscape if you think of how your landscape is and water collects. But like other, for butterflies, we often put out a nice water dish because they get those supplemental salts through that water as well. So you're not looking to put something that's going to be a mosquito attractant. You're looking for something that's going to enhance that landscape area, that butterfly garden, that bee garden. And you may just put some rocks that stay moist in there, a shallow dish. It's really up to you what the design looks like and what you like. But yeah, these insects do need supplemental water.
Great answer. Something not a lot of people think about. Thank you for that. So there's a lot of this kind of stuff about bee condos, bee hotels, things like that. So do those things work? And if so, could you like make one from a lumber pile, or how would you go about doing that?
The interesting thing is if we didn't have people around, these insects would have plenty of places to live without us. Unfortunately, with the way we impact the environment around us, we kind of take away their nesting sites. So there are a group of native bees that actually will use different types of materials to nest in. Even though they're solitary, they may use an old piece of wood that's hollowed out. They may use a burrow in the ground. So what we can do to help supplement that, where we've kind of gone through in some of these areas may not be as prevalent as they were, is we can formulate these bee nests or bee houses. And they're very simple to make. I've got a good publication from UGA up there, our friends over at Georgia. There's one from the University of Florida where you can use, if you want to take some of that invasive bamboo and, have a hollow area that you pile those together. What a lot of these native bees do, for example, the leafcutter bee, it will go collect material and line these hollow areas of rock or wood, and then they will section them off and lay an egg in there and put a pollen ball, and that's how they raise their young. So it's really fascinating how they work when you really see the behind the scenes of it. So you can get a piece of wood and drill holes in it. There'll be different size holes for different bees. Remember, they're not all the same size. There's different depths. So looking over those publications to decide if you want to use a 4x4, if you want to get some sticks and hollow those out, whatever you want to do, or buy one. These are excellent additives to make a good place for these bees to live. And just one interesting note, I think we have some time, right?
Got a minute or two.
Yeah, we identified a really neat leafcutter bee that was a carpenter bee mimic this year. A house had been left open for a year because of COVID, and these bees emerged from the bathroom once it was finished. And, these bees take advantage of these spots to nest. And one of these leafcutter bees had packed it a little home in this open house. And once it was finished, came out and the homeowner was concerned. But that's the good thing with extension. We're here to help, and we identify them as a beneficial leaf cutter bee that just took advantage of that home waiting to be finished.
Interesting. So if you take possession of a home that hasn't been worked on for a while or is open to the elements, you may have some bees living in there with you. So Stephen, we had a question from Facebook a couple minutes ago. I'm going to let you answer this one. Are loquat trees good for pollinators? And how large do they get? When do they bloom? What are their growing requirements? So if you could just hit on loquat real quick, that'd be fantastic.
Okay, well, loquat, they do bloom, obviously. And so a lot of pollinators can take advantage of that. It's one of the many that's out there. It's what I call a small to maybe, I would still stick with the small tree. Once it establishes, I wouldn't even call it a medium-sized tree. You're looking at 18 feet or so maximum, maybe 20, and a width of around about 12 to 14, somewhere in that range, maybe a little bit wider if it's really in a great healthy environment. It likes those organic-y soils. It likes a little bit of compost mixed in there. It likes to kind of sit in the edge of a bed, like a larger bed area, and take advantage of a little bit of the irrigation or whatever's happening in the lawn, but also a little protective from it. You just have to make sure that it's in a setting that where sometimes you can have some cold damage a little bit on them, so you have to be careful with it. If you have a lot of deer population, keep them out, because they will really, when that guy's young, they're going to work it hard.
Found that out the hard way this winter.
Yeah. And of course, the young bucks, they come through, and of course they're cleaning, and they'll rub the bark off real hard. And if it's a small trunk, they can finish that thing off quickly. And
yes, sir.
Yeah, and then you got a major disconnection and a plant that's going to slow starve to death. So, but it's a great little plant to have. It is. It's a novelty to watch and grow, and the insects do enjoy it.
Very good. Thank you for answering that. Kind of on the spot there. Beth, coming back to you for one. This plant is interesting. I've heard this from a lot of different people. And so the question is, we hear Carolina jessamine is bad for bees. And so why is it as bad as it is if they seem to love it? So just could you put to bed the Carolina jessamine issue for us real quick?
Okay, so what I found in my research, Carolina jessamine, we know is a toxic plant. We're not going to go out and eat it. We shouldn't. But right. A lot of times it's blooming in the winter months as we move from winter to spring. And so it is a food source that bees will visit. So remember, that's a native plant. Honeybees are non-native, so they didn't evolve together. And the honeybee body is relatively small. So some information back from a long time ago in the 1930s, they actually had some
even
reports.
Older than Stephen.
I know, very old, all of us here combined. So they had a report that, yes, they had bees feeding on Carolina jessamine, and they found some issues with developing larvae. However, I don't know that I found anything conclusive with honeybees other than anecdotal reports. But remember, they didn't evolve together. So with native bees, they've actually done some studies in a lab with 2 native bees, and they didn't come to any conclusive decisions about whether there are the effects that are negative. So remember, some of our native bees are very robust bodied. So they actually found that they didn't impact that native bee when they fed it in the lab. On cases, there were a few that they had reduced size in some of the brood, but still there's nothing just totally conclusive to say with these native bees. And they actually in the lab found a benefit of the Carolina jessamine chemical cleaning out some of the parasites from some of our larger bees. Now, this isn't necessarily translated to the field, and that work is still hopefully going to be done in the future. But for now, remember, it's a native plant. You've just learned you're going to have other things blooming at that time of year. So you're going to have a variety of things for these bees and pollinators to feed on. If you only had Carolina jessamine and you only had honeybees and that was their only food source, you could have seen some issues. But I would not hesitate to still enjoy Carolina jessamine in the landscape with our native bees, with a good, well-rounded landscape for pollinators.
Awesome. Yeah, it's such a pretty plant. You'd hate to totally exclude it. So I'm glad to know that it's not as bad as folks have said it is. So thank you, Beth. Stephen, this is an interesting question. I say they are all interesting, but I really like this one because I like to grow sunflowers. How do I grow sunflowers from a seed? How do we get those started? And what would you recommend to get them planted out in the garden?
Yeah, the sunflowers are relatively a simple plant if you really look at them. They're beautiful and they do all kinds of fun things, and they kind of give you a show and a blast. And sometimes it can be summer, sometimes it can be fall, depending on your selections and timings and when you plant. But yes, you can, depending on the sunflower, be successful with the seed. I would encourage starting it in trays with soilless potting media, just to get your germination level where you want it. If you're planting directly in the soil in the garden, that's an acceptable measure, but you just have to accept the fact that if, let's say you put out 100 seeds, you might get only about 30% or so coming, maybe 40. Especially like Beth had mentioned, we're so dry right now. It's we're getting a lot of intense sun, and you really got to stay on it with them. I like to, if I go into the garden and do that, and by the way, I do with wildflowers and things, and I'll rake back a lot of the organic top and work the soil a little bit, just lightly with like a heavy garden rake. And then I take a leaf rake once I put the seed out and do a kind of a fluff over it and get about 1/8 of an inch or so of soil over top. That way I'm getting a better seed to soil contact, and then you can do light moisture and really get some good germination.
Excellent. Yeah. So sunflower, really cool plant, attracts pollinators too, right?
Yes, it does. I think Julie covered that earlier.
Yeah. Awesome. Very good. Yeah. Kind of. That's been a few minutes ago. You know, we're not used to having a conference for more than a few minutes at the time anymore. Julie, this is a question that we gotten several times, and so what can we do as homeowners to ensure the safety of our pollinators? And then kind of an associated question, can you control for, negative insects and disease while also protecting pollinators? So I thought that was kind of a cool little double feature there. So I'm going to let you tackle that for us.
Yeah, I think a lot of it just comes down to, recognizing what's going on in the landscape. A lot of times the problems that we're having are actually cultural issues rather than disease or even insect pressure. Your plants, like Beth has mentioned, they've co-evolved with these insects, and they can handle a lot of feeding in different, well, really just feeding or being used for shelter by animals, including insects. But I think if we have these expectations that the plants are going to be completely perfect and there's not going to be any holes in the leaves, or they're not going to have a little bit of sooty mold here or there, that's when we kind of, set ourselves up to have an issue. But kind of going back to the cultural things, a lot of times it could be lack of water, it could be too much water, it could be that you put a shade plant in the sun or vice versa. The pruning at the wrong time. There's a lot of things that we do to our plants that cause damage that don't have anything at all to do with insects or pathogens. And we need to be able to recognize that. And that's where, of course, extension can help with troubleshooting and diagnosing. But if you do have something that does need to be treated, because if you don't, you're going to lose the plant or, the crop or whatever it is, then you just need to choose. If you have to use some type of a pesticide, you want to choose something that is as selective as possible. And you also want to make sure that you're not applying it at a time when you have a lot of pollinator activity. So that could be time of day, that could be time of year, it could be when the plant's in flower. There's a lot of different factors that are going to come into play. So, you just have to kind of consider all your management practices. Don't just jump to applying a pesticide, especially if it's not warranted, and then be really responsible with how you use it. Definitely follow the label, because the label will give you guidelines on how to make sure that you're not impacting pollinators or other non-target organisms, including ourselves. But you have to read that label.
The label is the law,
the label is the law. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. I've heard Julie say that a million times. I had to hear it again. So Julie, there's, a lot of times the plants that you buy at nurseries have been treated with insecticides. Is that also can that be an issue for pollinators as well?
Yeah, obviously, if you're trying to draw pollinators, or you're having a butterfly garden where you want the caterpillars to eat the plants, then you would want to avoid anything that's been treated with a systemic insecticide, just because you don't know when it was applied, you don't know what dosage it was, you don't know how long it's going to last in the plant material, and it varies. So if you are, trying to attract insects to your garden, then you would obviously want to avoid that, because, there's been a lot of, there's a lot of research going on, but the data is kind of mixed as far as, how much is present in the pollen or in the nectar, or even still in the leaf tissue after a certain amount of days. And there's too many factors for us to say, yes, it's totally safe, or no, it's definitely not safe. And so just the best practice is avoid it if you're trying to draw in insects, because there could be some negative impact.
Okay, that clears it up well enough for
it. Depends. It depends, Daniel.
There it is. So Beth, I'm so excited to hear your answer to this next question. A weed that we both love and that we also hate very much from time to time. And so the question is, how much Biden's alba is enough? Can you have enough Bidens?
We need more Bidens all over. Every roadside filled with Bidens. So this is a plan. If we did a poll of our audience, we would at least have half that like it and half that hate it. And the reason we don't like bidens is because of the nice little sticker seed head that attaches to us whenever we get anywhere close to it. It's almost like it jumps off the plant and gets on your dog, gets on cat in my case, gets on you.
No,
So
it'll be
it's-
cats in your case.
Yeah, S. So it's a negative plant in that sense, but this is a really good pollinator plant. So think about growing this in an area where you can kind of have that wildflower look, where you can kind of keep it a little more managed, pull up some seedlings if you need to. Once it's finished flowering, if you need to cut it off before those seeds mature, you can do that. But it is a really good pollinator plant with that flat open flower. It's also host to 2 butterflies that are not necessarily as showy as those wonderful swallowtails. We have a sulfur, we have a dusky wing that love it where it kind of grows in those disturbed areas at the edges of wood sides or in ditches. So everyone should have a little bit of bidens, but we don't want it to go too wild. So kind of keep it in check.
I like it. It is a lovely plant. It truly is, despite its annoyance. It's a good one. And Beth, our final question today, again, if y'all have any burning questions you'd like for us to get to before we close out today, feel free to throw it in the chat or again, there in the Q&A at the bottom. But we'll finish up with this question for right now. Beth, a Zoom listener wants to know, do those bee rest stop homes with the little tubes actually work? And we've all seen those things, and I've walked past them at craft shows and things like that. So is it worth a purchase?
Yeah, so remember we talked about kind of the bee hotels earlier. So if it's the right size and the right depth for the bee you want to attract, then yes, they can use it. If they're finding something else in your landscape, if you have a really nice kind of diverse landscape, they may just be nesting elsewhere and not need it. But if you don't keep if you kind of have more of the clean landscape where you cut everything back, don't leave some sticks around, then maybe one of those nice bee hotels will work. And to finish on that thought for me, imperfections are okay. If you want pollinators, you really need some imperfections. So have these nesting sites. Turf doesn't always have to be perfect, especially as we transition from winter to spring. Those open areas are really good spots for native bees that are in the ground to nest, and leaving some of that debris from your perennials, that's where they can nest as well. So if you don't have that, maybe these ones that you can purchase are what's needed in your garden.
Awesome. And we got a little follow-up to our Biden's question. Where would you purchase Biden? So can you actually buy that plant? And if not, how would you recommend the folks go about acquiring Bidens if they're not fortunate enough to have a population in their yard?
I would say go walk through any ditch or roadside when it's in bloom, when the seeds are there, and you will have Bidens in your yard year after year.
You don't even necessarily have to harvest it. Bidens will come to you in many cases. It will stick onto your clothing and all that kind of stuff. So we do want to thank everybody for attending today. Please fill out our survey before you leave. Cannot tell you how much it means to us when you do that. Gives us a lot of information about how to best move forward and what topics you'd like to see. Helps us do better next time. Speaking of next time, our next Gardening in the Panhandle Live is not until September 15th. We are taking a hiatus over the summer. This summer is going to be very busy for quite a few of us, and it just worked out that we thought it would be best to regroup in the early fall. So we'll be back September the 15th talking about the winter garden. So that fall and winter garden, we'll get this session out in time for you to get everything planted. So don't worry about that. Come see us before you plant your winter garden on September the 15th, and we will see y'all then. Have a great afternoon, everybody.